Okay, I don't have any notes, but this is going to be my take on acquisition versus learning. That is the language learning theory of acquisition versus learning. Now, first and foremost, I, I understand that uh, when you are working in a particular field or in a particular industry, you you have terminology which is different from the common person's usage or understanding of certain words. In other words, a word that means something to the mainstream will mean something slightly different to a particular field of study. However, having said that, if I Google the definition of the word learn, the first thing that pops up on my screen is verb number one: gain or acquire knowledge of uh, or skill in something by study, experience, or being taught. Let me repeat the first three words: gain or acquire. So, learn means to gain or acquire. So, you've got one word from the definition plus the original word. I would say learn is the most common, or is the more common of the two words in the English language. Um, and and then they take another word that's in the definition and try to put them in separate categories. I would argue that since learn is the more common word, maybe learn should have the broadest meaning when we're talking about language. So, in other words, flip them around. And what a baby does or a child does is learn because it's the simplest form of the word, while as acquire sounds a little more sophisticated and technical. But no, they had to, the linguists had to do it the other way around. And having said the linguists, obviously I consider myself a linguist, but I have no qualifications, no certifications, whatever in linguistics, uh, and uh, most of my evidence that I call on you could probably call anecdotal. However, I myself have learned languages of every stage at every stage in my life, so I think I kind of know what I'm talking about. I've also taught children at different stages, at every different stage, and adults at every different stage in their lives. And I've taught my own child how to be bilingual or trilingual if you count the first method that we started out with, which was baby sign language. All right, so um, I'm not certified in linguistics, but I have a lot of experience in a lot of different languages, learning, teaching, translating, and simultaneous interpretation. So I think I have a fairly decent sense of what the theories behind learning and acquisition could be. But let's stick with the definitions that the linguists and the language teachers are using. So, acquisition is what a baby does different from what adults do? I would argue that fundamentally they are not different. We are learning pretty much learning or acquiring. I would argue they're pretty much the same thing. The only difference is that uh, while kids learn wide eyed and absorbing like sponges, adults have lots of other things to think about and worry about. And we adults also have learned tricks for remembering as well as forgetting things. So things that we consider not to be important, we purposefully forget them or just choose not to think about them. Things that we want to remember, sometimes it's difficult for us to remember, so we learn tricks, which include taking notes, making flashcards, repetition, spaced repetition, and so on and so forth. And adults can handle complex concepts such as grammar. Therefore, grammar itself is a shortcut to language learning, which might take a kid several years to pick up on. They might repeat certain things correctly, but when it comes to um, exceptions to rules, they continue to get them wrong. My daughter still gets them wrong, and sometimes I correct her, sometimes I don't, because I mean, what's the point really? If she gets the rule, to me, it doesn't really matter if it's not applied, if the rule isn't applied in a particular case. Um, and there was one this morning. I can't remember what it was that I corrected her, or sometimes I don't even correct her usually. I just take what she says and I kind of turn it around and kind of make a little game out of it, or make a little joke out of it. And I can't remember what it was this morning. It was something like the most the most best, or the more better, or something like that. And I kind of play around with it and then I say it in a correct way. So she gets the idea that that's maybe not exactly how we use it or say it. Yeah, so learning versus acquisition, I think these are two BS terms, but they have to exist because, you know, there are master's programs and PhDs and thesis papers to be written and things like that. Now, as for can we learn, and I'm using the word in the broad sense of the word learn, can we learn from children? Can we mimic how children learn? Of course we can. In the comments section of the Jeff Brown video, someone commented to somebody, I don't know if it was to me or somebody else, you are missing the point. What he means is, so there's a 57-minute video and people in the comments are having to tell us what he means. He spent 57 minutes trying to say it, so I think he failed somewhat if somebody in the comments is having to explain what it is that we don't get. And I think that what we can learn from kids is, at times, not always, but at times, blocking out the first language and focusing on the language you're trying to speak. Of course, it's logical, it's common sense. When you start talking, you don't want to be thinking about the grammar while you're speaking. You want to have practiced the language to the point where it just flows fluently, right? But that takes practice, that takes time. So there are times when you're trying to speak where you might have to be like, second person singular, or second person plural. What is the conjugation of the verb in that particular language? And so on. But there's no clear line for me between this acquisition phase and this learning phase. Maybe somebody has defined it more clearly or more black and white. But I would argue that when we start learning our own language and rules to our own language, like let's say in elementary school, they don't even call it, at least in the United States, they don't call it grammar, they call it language or English. And then they differentiate later on between literature and grammar and so on. But it's a gradual process. I think they start slowly trying to teach us how to speak correctly and how to, read and write and spell correctly and punctuate. It's a very, very gradual process with your native language. And we are taught that. It's different. I'm sure it's different, a little bit different in every language and in every country. But for example, in Japan, I've noticed that they call their own language, when it's taught as a subject at school, kokugo. So basically like the nation's language. And at least in Japan, the only other foreign language they're teaching at at younger ages is English, which is called Eigo. So you've got the national language, Kokugo, which the language itself is usually called Nihongo, Japanese, but Kokugo means the nation's language. And then you have Eigo, which is the only foreign language that gets taught at younger ages. So I don't think there's a black and white divisory point, but I don't know. Maybe there's a definition out there somewhere that is. Okay, so this is part one about learning versus acquisition. I'm going to push stop now because it's 10 minutes. And maybe I'm going to break down how I learned languages in different videos and how they are different from each other. Okay, so this is part two on the Jeff Brown response, but there's a lot more coming because I've written about this before and I've thought about it a lot. And probably if you scroll down in La Tertulia, you can find where I've written about it before. But I've got the flow. Thanks, Rod, for giving me the inspiration in the form of Jeff Brown. Okay. A presto. See you soon.